As I noted on Wednesday, there is a vast amount of literature in books and medical journals devoted to Van Gogh's illness, and yet there remains no consensus of opinion about its cause. Leading theories include temporal lobe epilepsy, bipolar or manic depressive disorder, acute intermittent chorea, digitalis intoxication, and lead poisoning. Not surprisingly, there is a staggering amount of misinformation still in circulation. Now again, forgive me for repeating this, but I think it's really important for the context of our discussion here. In 1906, Julius Meyer Graf, who was the author of one of the artist's most influential early biographies, wrote that Van Gogh was, quote, insane when he created his most magnificent paintings in the mental hospital in Arles. The German psychiatrist, Dr. Karl Jaspers, wrote in 1922 that Van Gogh suffered from schizophrenia, a severe mental disorder that affected his paintings from 1888 onward. In 1928, two French doctors, Detroit and Leroy, published excerpts from the artist's medical records in their book, The Madness of Van Gogh. Based on those records, they concluded that Van Gogh was not insane, but instead suffered from intermittent attacks, which they believe was due to epilepsy, and as medical experts would now more precisely define that as temporal lobe epilepsy, which is a disorder in which there's an excess of mental activity in the frontal part of the brain in which the person becomes overwhelmed and may experience auditory and visual hallucinations. It is really crucial to note that Van Gogh's doctors stressed that his seizures were only temporary and that during the intervening periods he returned to his senses and was able to paint and write unimpaired. Van Gogh's mysterious illness continues to fascinate medical professionals today. Dr. Shamran Koshben, a neurologist who teaches at Harvard Medical School, offers lectures on the subject. Dr. Wilford Arnold, who is professor of biochemistry and molecular biology at the University of Kansas Medical School, has written books and taught courses on Van Gogh's illness. To help us sort through Van Gogh's medical history and illness, I'd like to turn to a renowned medical expert, Dr. Joseph Calabrese, professor of psychiatry at Case Western Reserve Medical School, as well as director of the Bipolar Research Center and the Mood Disorders Program at University Hospitals. Dr. Calabrese received his BS in psychiatry from Xavier University, completed his medical training at Ohio State University, and served his psychiatric residency at the Cleveland Clinic. After completing a research fellowship at the National Institute of Mental Health in 1989, he returned to Cleveland to found the Mood Disorders Program. He has written over 220 scientific publications focusing on the treatment of bipolar disorder. He received the Lifetime Achievement Award for research into mood disorders, the Ohio Physicians Lifetime Achievement Award, and the European Bipolar Forum's Lifetime Achievement Award. Would you please give a warm welcome to Dr. Joseph Calabrese.
We're going to talk about his artistic genius at the same time we talk about his illness. Because one of his biggest contributions, I think, is that he showed us the upside of bipolar disorder. People who have bipolar disorder have a tremendous rate of achievement and productivity. So let's go ahead and get started. He had an intense personality. However, he was also impulsive and chaotic. So that characterizes him a lot. And I think one of his most important contributions is that he showed us the upside to bipolar disorder. And now we recognize this illness as being accompanied by very special talents in addition to having the symptoms of the illness. Let's talk about Vincent's family. His father was a strict Calvinist. His mother was described as also being an artist, but being extremely moody. One of the most unique things about Vincent van Gogh's birth is that he was born on the exact date, 1 year after his parents' firstborn stillbirth son, also named Vincent, on the exact date. And then he's described as showing early signs of moodiness, if you will, taking after his mother early in life. Now, this is an interesting family portrait, if you might say. You see that Theodorus is on top, Anna, the mother, on top as well. And then you see Vincent was the oldest in a sibship of 6, 3 boys and 3 girls. When you look at these figures, the squares are males, the circles are females. The X refers to a suicide in the family. And then the blue, a homogeneous blue box, means bipolar disorder. And then yellow means some other illness that wasn't specified. So you can see here, it wasn't just Vincent that had a difficulty with mood or psychiatric symptoms. He also had his brother Theo, who we'll be talking quite a bit about, who had some type of psychiatric illness, poorly defined, and his youngest sister, Wilhelmina, who went by Will, she spent more than 30 years in a psychiatric institution. And then his youngest brother, Cornelius, he suicided on the battlefield during the Boer War, if I got that right. So that's not surprising for people who know about the genetics of psychiatric illness. The heritability of bipolar disorder is 80%. Okay, so let's talk about his first episode. His first episode occurred in 1873. He was 20 at the time. Nothing surprising about that. We now know that the majority of serious illness occurs prior to the age of 24. 75% of people who have a psychiatric illness have had symptoms prior to the age of 25. While in London, he worked for Goupil and Company, as I mentioned. He boarded at the home of Madame Loyer. And here he experienced his first of 3 unrequited love affairs after being rejected by Madame Loyer's 19-year-old daughter. At that time, he went home, and he had his first, what I would call, serious or syndromal depression. And he spent some time at home and finally came back. He returned to London in the winter of 1874 and still into this episode of depression. So in 1875, he cycled from depression into hypomania. Hypomania just means a mild high. The manic phase of bipolar disorder is a phase in which people experience elevated mood. Their mood is increased compared to baseline. And then sometimes the mood is irritable as well. So this is 1875, his first episode. He cycles continuously from depression to hypomania. And in this year, he was promoted at Goupil's and transferred to the Goupil headquarters in Paris. In September of 75 of this year, he cycles from depression to hypomania again, and this time, his symptoms were accompanied by prominent impulsiveness, a core feature of bipolar disorder. Without forethought or telling his employer, he left the company and went home, and this was part of his impulsiveness that he was experiencing from the hypomania. And when he came back, he was asked to resign. He became angry. He did lots of inappropriate things. He was criticizing the artwork at the company as being flawed, and he got into a lot of trouble. And then he turned from, his passion suddenly changed and turned from the amorous to the study of theology. So on the surface, you might think that's not, that remarkable, but hyperreligiosity is very commonly seen in the manic or hypomanic phase of the illness. So now we're up to 1879. He cycles from hypomania back to a second episode of depression. Again, it doesn't look like there was any intervening period of well period. And while administering to the poor, his charitable behavior is viewed as being excessive. Eventually, he got fired, and the minister who fired him said this. He said, he did not know the meaning of submission, his independence, his inability to conform, his some sudden outbursts of anger. So you can see the chaotic part of his mood coming out here. He was unable to moderate himself during the hypomania. He was fired for a second time and went right into another episode of depression. Okay, so we're up to 1881, and he's in a lengthy period of hypomania, lots of impulsiveness. He continues to show signs of this hypomania. It's not mild, it's not periodic, it's persistent. In August of 1881, he pursues a woman by the name of Key von Stricker, and the daughter of his recently widowed cousin. He grew relentless and tactless and made threats. And in this instance, he threatened what we would call as self-injurious behavior. So self-injurious behavior is sometimes seen in psychiatric illness, and it's when people injure themselves. And sometimes after this, there's an increase in endorphins within the brain, and it has an antidepressant-like effect. In 1882, he went into his third chaotic relationship. Again, it looked like he was hypomanic at the time. Again, this was punctuated by a depression, and for the first time here, he had his first psychiatric hospitalization. By late May 1882, he has no money. Spending sprees are an important part of hypomania or mania, and agrees under pressure to not marry C.N., acting on his brother's recommendation. Actually, he needed the money. And then he cycled into his third depression, and then as I mentioned, he was admitted to City Hospital. This was his first hospitalization. So you can see here that during these periods where he was symptomatic, he was artistically productive. It wasn't either or. That is to say, there truly is an upside to bipolar disorder. You can see at the very time he was cycling from depression to hypomania, he was continuously productive and really, producing some unbelievably artwork. Here, it's now 1888, and in the south of France, there's a region called Provence, and this is when he began to have psychotic symptoms. So, all the while before, he had hypomania and periods of depression, but no psychotic symptoms. The psychotic symptoms did not come until the last couple of years. So he was 35 at the time, and then he moved to a particular region called Arles in the south of France, in the region of Provence. And here you can see he's developed into a highly accomplished artist, but still he's unable to sell his paintings. And here, I think, is when he began to make this transition into what we would call artistic genius. His paintings become very intense, very robust, and very colorful. There's something that people who have bipolar disorder experience. It's not common, but it's called hyperacusis, and it involves the enhancement of senses. So during an episode of mania, sometimes people hear things that are louder than they actually sound, or they see the color yellow as being more bright than it actually is. Or if they're in your office and your air conditioner goes on, they'll find the increase in the air conditioner irritating. That's real. It's called hyperacusis. And I think that contributed to his artistic genius. However, tragically, he did have his first psychotic episode in December of 1888. So he's now in the south of France, in Arles, and he says the following, which I thought was pretty remarkable. He says, "I was surely about to suffer a stroke when I left Paris. It affected me quite a bit, and when I stopped drinking and smoking so much, and as I began to think, good heavens, what despair and how much fatigue I felt at the time. He writes a letter to Theo, and he says, feverish creative activity alternated with episodes of listlessness, feeling dull or flat, to the point of sheer exhaustion. So when people are in a depression, it's kind of like having mononucleosis, that pervasive fatigue that never goes away. And then he has unpredictable mood swings from dysphoria. Dysphoria is an unpleasant high, accompanied by agitation and restlessness, to periods of euphoria. So the highs aren't just pleasant. Some highs are euphoric, but other highs are dysphoric. To episodes of indescribable anguish, that's the depression, and episode acceleration. Episode acceleration refers to the fact that his episodes were getting shorter and he was starting to cycle more. His episode frequency was increasing. His illness was maturing. And then Paul Gauguin enters the scene. In October of '88, Theo persuades his friend to join him in the South, the studio in the South. And Vincent described the relationship as follows. Our disputes are at times excessively animated, like with electricity. At times we end up with tired and empty heads, like an electric battery after discharge. So now it's December 23, 1888. He is 8 years into his period of productivity, about 15 years into his illness. Van Gogh and Gauguin relationship, it begins to deteriorate. After 2 months of his stay, Gauguin's stay, Gauguin announces his intent to leave. He could not tolerate Vincent anymore. Enraged, Vincent throws a glass of absinthe in Gauguin's face. Gauguin, who felt, fond of Vincent, like a brother, he wraps him up and takes him home to bed. And then a very bizarre sequence of events ensues. Gauguin leaves the house. Vincent follows him, and Vincent approaches him with an open razor. Gauguin defends against the knife. Vincent goes home, and he cuts off what I understand is one of his ears completely off. He washes it. He places it in an envelope. And then he presents it to Rachel, his favorite prostitute. So he's getting disorganized, you can tell, and he's having psychotic symptoms. Rachel, of course, notifies the police, who finds Vincent unconscious at home. The police take him to Arles Hospital in San Reme, and he's placed under the care of Felix Ray, an intern. So for all the residents that are here, this was an intern. He was 23 years old, and his job was to treat Van Gogh. He was hospitalized for 2 weeks and then released. So this is what was seen on the hospital discharge summary. Acute mania with hallucinations of sight, that would be called visual hallucinations, and hallucinations of hearing things, that will be called auditory hallucinations, which have caused him to mutilate himself by cutting off his left ear. February 4th, he has his second emergency psychiatric hospitalization, what would actually be his third hospitalization, the last 2 of which were emergency. And here, he experiences disorganized delusions and hallucinations, and he's put in seclusion. He attempts suicide several times now during this third hospitalization, ingesting turpentine or paint or lamp oil, resulting in delirium. Afterwards, he has no memory of his attack on Gauguin, no memory at all. The self-mutilation, no memory, or the early part of his hospitalization, no memory. And after several weeks, he recovers completely, and he writes the following to Theo. He says, "The intolerable hallucinations have ceased. In fact, they've diminished to simple nightmares as a result of taking potassium bromide. I believe I am rather well just now, except for a certain undercurrent of vague sadness." Dr. Ray now is providing him with outpatient care. He was discharged from his third hospitalization. 2 weeks after discharge, Vincent was noted to be abusing absinthe again. And for 1 year, he was not treated with any medication. And it was a terrible year. Vincent experienced additional psychotic symptoms, bizarre behaviors, complete amnesia. He tried to poison himself with paint, with turpentine, with lamp oil. He resumed his abuse of absinthe during his leaves of abstinence from the hospital. And his last episode was a very severe psychotic episode with terrifying hallucinations and very severe agitation, lasting from February 23 to April 29, 65 days. That's a very long, very severe episode of psychosis. So I think that when you look back at his life, what you see is 30 residential changes, 5 or 6 jobs. You see he was quarrelsome, he was untidy, he was stubborn, had difficulty getting along with people. He was very engaging, though. He experienced what he called intense, unbearable emotionality. He says here, "I'm a man of passion, capable and prone to undertake more or less foolish things, which I happen to repent more often or less." I mean, it's just unbelievable insight. So he's painting these masterpieces while he has these keen insights into all of his problems and all of his agony. And this is probably the most moving or the most robust. He says, "As for me, you must know that I shouldn't precisely have chosen madness if there had been any choice." And that very much is the case for people who have a psychiatric illness. So the unique thing here is there are very few people that can articulate it like this. Vincent continues to exhibit suicidal ideation at the same time. It's May, June, and July of 1890. He was declared cured and discharged, as I mentioned. After 3 days in Paris, on his way back to the north of Paris, he's going north to live in an artist colony in a suburb of Paris, northwest Paris, called Auvers. And he says, although noise in Paris wasn't for me, and he moves on, he takes up residence near Paul Gaucher, who is a physician and friend of the artist who resides in this same suburb of Paris. And he abstains from drinking, remains seizure-free and psychosis-free, but his depression persists. So as you can see here, even towards the end, his artistic productivity is increasing still in Auvers. During the last 70 days of his life, he completes 70 paintings, 30 drawings, rarely includes bright, colorful, heavenly bodies anymore. So you can almost feel like he's starting to withdraw. After completing this painting, Vincent said, and this is moving, "It is not difficult to express here my entire sadness and extreme loneliness." The day of the suicide attempt. 3 days after painting Field with stacks of wheat, Vincent shot himself in his upper abdomen. And I must tell you, I've never heard, it's very unusual to have a suicide by shooting in the abdomen. It's just, I've never seen it before. So this is unusual. It's almost as if he wanted to suffer. This is the death notice in the newspaper. It is amazing. It's Sunday, the 27th of July, a certain Van Gogh, 37 years old, Dutch nationalist, artist, transient in Auvers, shot himself with a revolver in the fields, and only wounded, returned to his room, where he died the next day. Okay, so let's pause a second and talk about his artistic productivity during the last year of his life. First of all, the last 10 years of his life, he was continuously productive, and he was cycling continuously. This is a unique slide. This comes from Arnold's work, published in 1992. And what you can see here as an exponential increase in productivity. So on the vertical axis here, what you have is the number of works he created per month, every 30 days. And on the bottom is the 10-year period of his symptomatic, the 10-year period of his artistic productivity. And you can see here, there's this dramatic increase in productivity during the last couple of years. He produced over 300 additional works of art, among them several copies of religious scenes by older masters and the transcendental masterpiece, Starry Night. During this hospitalization, the last one, Vincent's productivity apparently increased even as his illness worsened. So this is his contribution. He's basically telling us that you can still be productive and talented and creative and have a mental illness. He did it.